So, first of all, hi. Thank you for having me. And we've been trying to organize this for a little bit now, but time zones make things a fun logistical challenge. And I'm glad that I got my time zones correct because had we done this a day earlier, this would have been very awkward as I would have had to have live streamed probably from a plane. So much prefer to be doing it in my office today. Now, have you spoken with our audience about what we're talking about today, or would you like me to give a quick explainer?
I can give a quick introduction to everyone. This is Chris Emerson. They're the owner of the YouTube channel Rex's Hangar, very good aviation YouTube channel. Been following them for quite a few years now. And they like to cover a lot of obscure aviation topics, particularly a lot of Curtiss stuff, sort of goes hand in hand with that goal, I think. And I believe you had a YouTube video on the SB2C and a really good one on the P40, but we have had one of our speakers has covered the P40 pretty recently. So I asked for you to do a little presentation on the SB2C if that was possible. But
Yeah,
thank you
no,
so much
of
for being
course.
to do that.
No, my pleasure. And yeah, it's the SB2C. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for it because of its just but also unjust reputation as being something of a nightmare. And so I sort of wanted to focus more on that today, seeing as we've only got about an hour, rather than go into a whole spiel about the whole history of the aircraft itself, because that is hours worth of discussions. So I thought I'd start with just a basic question, which was the SB2C really that bad? And, if you do just a quick Google on it, you'll just see videos coming up going, oh, it was a flying death trap, or the aircrews hated it, it was a doomed design, etc., etc., etc. But, was it like that, or was it more the victim of circumstance and bad requirements? And the long answer is yes, and the short answer is also yes, but with different terms and conditions applied. But what I'll quickly do is we'll do a quick overview of what the SB2C was and is, and then we'll look into the reasons behind why it wasn't particularly favored by the Navy, at least at the beginning. So the SB2C was a carrier-based dive bomber. It was developed to replace the SBD Dauntless for use. It was intended to be in service pretty much around the time when the Pacific War kicked off for the States. Obviously, they didn't know they were going to be involved at that specific time. However, its development was protracted and troubled from the onset and beyond the entry of the aircraft into its operational life. Its test flight was in December of 1940, but it was not combat debuted until 1943, basically 2 years and 11 months later. And considering by that point the United States have been at war for almost 12 months, there must have been some very big problems in its development for its entry into service to being delayed that much. Now, the SB2C is famous for two things. One, its troubled history. Actually, three things. One, its troubled history. Two, its sort of rise from the grave. And three, it was the last dedicated dive bomber built for the US Navy. And that leaves it with something of a complicated legacy. An ironically funny part about the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver was when it was entering service, when it had so many problems with it that a US Navy captain opted to use them as impromptu sea anchors rather than operate them, was there were Curtiss posters advertising it as the fist of the US Navy, dropping bombs on various caricatures of Japanese warships. Now, of course, this was not the case. A lot of people might know that the SB2C received a lot of very unflattering nicknames, such as the Beast or the Son of a Bitch Second Class, which is a reference to the acronym of SB2C. Despite its poor reputation, though, the Helldiver went on to become a very effective dive bomber for the US Navy. It was built in frighteningly huge numbers, over 7,000 were built, and it was one of the few aircraft of its age and class to see extensive post war use. Sorry, that's my phone going off. Go away. Yeah, so it saw extensive post-war use. It was in frontline service with the United States Navy until around 1947, and it was in the reserves for a few years after that. And it also saw use overseas with the French, and it also featured in the Greek Civil War. In terms of its battle record, it basically featured in every major naval carrier engagement after it entered service, and it was responsible for either the sinking or the assisted sinking of a vast amount of Japanese tonnage, including assisting with the sinking of the Yamato and the Musashi, as well as striking a wide range of other Japanese targets, including freighters, oil tankers, ground targets, and it was involved in a lot of actions against Japanese island air bases, so it was often actually destroying other aircraft just by bombing them or strafing them on the ground. So the issue is with the Helldiver, it became a very good aircraft pretty early on, to be honest. Like, it entered service in late 1943, and by mid 1944, a lot of its problems had essentially gone away, and the US Navy was incredibly happy with what they had. The issue is, though, it was tainted by reputation, and this was a taint that not only affected the aircraft and the perception by its crews, it's affected its perception all the way through to today, and it had a huge impact on the perception of Curtiss-Wright as an aircraft manufacturer. And many sources and historians consider it to be the trigger point for the downfall of Curtiss as a manufacturer in general, which is not a particularly nice thing to have on your reputation as a plane. But the question is, was this the fault of the aircraft itself and Curtiss by extension as a manufacturer, or was it a victim of design requirements? Ultimately, it is a combination of a few things. However, many of the Helldiver's problems can be traced back to the convoluted and sometimes contradictory requirements that the Navy issued in the first place. Which takes us to this wonderful topic that it was doomed by requirements. And when you take apart everything else from the argument, the dominating factor is that, yes, the requirements to which the Helldiver was built for the US Navy were the largest contributor to the problems that it encountered, particularly in its development, which took almost 3 years. Most US Navy craft at the time were, of course, commissioned by the Bureau of Aeronautics. Some were done as private ventures, which were then taken interest in by the Bureau of Aeronautics, but most were built to specifications in the same way that in the UK you have Air Ministry specifications, etc. And the Helldiver was built to specification SD 1110-25, which is a wonderful title. And it was built to be a replacement for the venerable SBD Dauntless. These specifications were announced in early 1938, and they detailed a brief which was aiming for a significantly more powerful and capable dive bomber to replace the SBD Dauntless in the US Navy's fleet carrier service, with the intent that it should begin replacing those units by early 1941 at the latest. However, as hindsight would quickly show, the requirements that the Bureau of Aeronautics laid out were far too complicated, basically. So, in a broad nutshell, a lot of the requirements on their own, or even a few linked together, weren't too bad, and they were fairly run of the mill for this time. A few were ahead of their time, even by 1938. But it was required to be a single engine and two-place scout dive bomber. A new requirement for the Navy was they wanted all of the bomb load to be carried internally, whereas previously on the Dauntless you had your external bomb racks, but with the SB2C they wanted everything in an internal bomb bay to improve streamlining, and this meant that it had to carry a 1,000-pound bomb internally. Range with this bomb load was also meant to be impressive, with a 1,000-mile range, fueled and loaded with bombs. And it was to be powered by the new, at the time, Wright 2600 twin Cyclone. Additional factors included things like a retractable landing gear, which by this point was pretty far par for the course, and armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were insisted upon on the outset, which for a Navy aircraft at the time, this was a new thing because previous aircraft like the Dauntless, the Douglas Devastator, and fighter aircraft like the Wildcat all started out without armor protection or self-sealing fuel tanks, and they very quickly learned at the start of the Pacific campaign that having those two things was incredibly useful to have. We then get on to the things that make this a problem for the Curtiss-Wright company. All of these requirements so far some were ambitious, but most were fairly doable. Another requirement was that they wanted a double split flap system and high capacity dive brakes, which is fair enough. But these split flaps, dive brakes, the landing gear system, the defensive turret that they wanted built on it, and a whole slew of other things were to be operated by a comprehensive hydraulic system, and this complicated the design of the Helldiver significantly. So, the hydraulics, and I've brought some notes with me for this one because I was trying to memorize everything about this, and I'll be honest, I completely failed. I'm not very good at public speaking. I've only done a few of these talks so far. But in a nutshell, the hydraulic system was far too ambitious for the time. Even 10, 15 years later, most naval aircraft had a lot of ambitious and large and extensive hydraulic systems. But this was really the first time that something like this was attempted. And to attempt it on something that was immediately going to be pressed into frontline and extensive use as a naval aircraft on bumpy aircraft carriers in the open ocean where you are far away from major servicing points was perhaps not the wisest of moves, and this came back to bite the Navy in the backside very quickly. The hydraulics of the Helldiver was often referred to as a plumber's nightmare, and the hydraulics were responsible for the folding wings, which included the actuator and the locking pins, the landing flaps and the dive brakes, the internal bomb bay doors, the main landing gear, the tail wheel, the expander tube brakes on the wheels, the powered turret, the forward fixed armament charges, the wing folding mechanism, slats, and the emergency and booster fuel pumps. This was an extensive system of which at any point something disastrous would go wrong, and there weren't a lot of redundancies built in because of another requirement which we will get into briefly. The hydraulics were one of the two biggest problems that the Helldiver would face, and they were probably the second biggest contributing factor to its poor reputation when it entered service. From the outset, it suffered from widespread system failures. So some of the first Helldivers that became operational were aboard the USS Yorktown in spring of 1943, not too far away from when the Battle of Midway is to take place. The entire hydraulic system, they found out, could be put out of operation by the failure of one of any of 900 different lines on the design. And I've looked through some of the blueprints of this because if you go on the US National Archive, there's some maintenance manuals for the Helldiver, and they are truly monstrously thick. And I'm surprised that they were even able to get a dozen operational at this point. Just to give a few examples that I've written down here, you had numerous bomb bay door malfunctions, which led to the point it got so bad that they were basically removing the bomb bay doors and essentially just having an open chasm at the bottom of the airframe, because up to 50% fail rate with the bomb bay doors either failing to open or then failing to close in the first 2 months of operational service. Now, 50% is an appalling rate of failure. You also had a flap and aileron control issue, which sounds bad on its own, but this came into especially bad prevalence with the flap system, particularly when it came to landing aboard carriers. There were numerous instances during operation and also during working up and testing periods where the flaps would either fail to deploy upon landing, or in fact after takeoff they would sometimes fail to retract. And you also had cases of asymmetric flap extension, so where one of the flaps would extend and the other one wouldn't, which would of course lead to all sorts of nasty problems, usually resulting in the Helldiver being ditched in the sea astern of the aircraft carrier, and the crews hopefully not drowning and then getting fished out of the sea. There is a particular incident that I wanted to note, which was on the 25th of January 1943, following a routine takeoff. The outboard flap of the aircraft failed to retract. The investigation found that a pivot pin on one of the torque shaft universal joints had snapped, and no less than 74 other joints were either fatigued or badly worn out to the point of failure already. And this was an aircraft that had only been in operation for less than a month. So, not a particularly good start for the Helldiver with the hydraulics. But if the hydraulics were one problem, the biggest problem by far and away was the elevator requirement. Had one of these requirements been the only major requirement for the Helldiver, things could have been different. But these two combined were a massive issue. So the primary requirement specified by Bureau of Aeronautics when they wrote up the requirements for the Helldiver was that two of these new dive bombers had to fit on the elevator of the new USS Essex class fleet carriers. Now, this elevator is 41 feet by 48 feet, and they wanted two to fit on this with a clearance of at least 12 inches all around. That is a very tight and compact space. Because of this, a couple of things had to be done. One, the wings had to have had folding mechanisms, which went against the Navy's initial wishes because various senior officers in the Navy, including those serving aboard aircraft carriers, did not want dive bombers to have folding wings because that is, of course, going to introduce multiple potential points of failure. And you want the wings on a dive bomber, especially, to be as structurally rigid and as sound as possible. The other knock-on effect of this was you're essentially wanting to fit what is essentially quite a large airframe in a very small space and then fit two of them in that small space as well. And this meant that the dimensions of the Helldiver were not as Curtiss would have liked. If you look at numerous photos, you will see that it has a very stubby and broad fuselage in relation to its wingspan. This was a departure from conventional aeronautical design at the time, and it would lead to all sorts of stability issues, and it would be one of the contributing factors towards the Helldiver having a very distinctive feature, which was its large tail. I mean, it's big enough to have its own zip code at this point. This was done to compensate a lack in stability following early flight tests. This and numerous other changes to accommodate the elevator requirement led to one of two things: instability or too much weight, often at the same time. And when those two things are combined, you are going to have an airframe which is incredibly difficult to handle for rookie pilots and even veteran pilots alike. The third thing that comes into this now is the human factor, because you've got an aircraft which has got a vastly complicated hydraulic system, which has got a lot of points of failure. And you have also now got an aircraft which is becoming heavier than originally intended because they're having to make multiple improvements to improve its stability. And you also have the stability issue as well, which is never truly solved until much later iterations of the Helldiver. This results in a very high rate of attrition and a tragic loss of young and inexperienced pilots in new and already serving aircraft carriers as they're working up. There were lots of reports about people going from the Douglas SBD Dauntless, which, some were saying it was a flying brick anyway, but at least it was a stable flying brick, going over to the Helldiver and suddenly finding themselves in all sorts of strife. This, above all else, is what contributed to its early poor reputation, was when it was essentially working up with the fleet, particularly in the USS Yorktown, and I'll cite that a few times because she was the most vocal early critic, was the early attrition rate, and this became known as a widowmaker very quickly. The absolute ironic thing is that later on, when the Helldiver is actually entering service, 3 years after it was originally required by the US Navy, the biggest requirement that affected it, which was the elevator requirement, was removed because improved practices aboard fleet carriers essentially rendered the requirement to shove two planes onto an elevator obsolete. The original idea behind the whole thing was they wanted faster turnaround in fleet carrier operations, and so, okay, best way to do this is if we can cram two planes on one elevator, get them up onto the flight deck quicker, that's obviously going to speed up operations. But various other things outside the scope of this discussion today rendered that change moot, and so when the Helldiver entered service, the biggest thing that contributed to its issues had already been removed from its requirements, which is perhaps one of the biggest ironic things of the whole facade, really. Now, all of this leads to a poor beginning with the Helldiver. So you've got a complicated airframe and you have an unstable airframe. I'll just give a couple of quick points as to some of the issues that this brought up. Early models were described, and I'm just quoting verbatim here from some of the reports that I found on the US National Archives, as being difficult to handle. This included any time when carrier landings had approach speeds of around 85 knots. Test pilots noted that the forces on the controls were heavy and sluggish, and that stalls upon approach to the carrier were not uncommon. The absolute last thing you want to be encountering on the way to your aircraft carrier after a potentially long and dangerous sortie with battle damage, etc., is your aircraft stalling, because that means only one thing: you are going into the sea. The other thing that really, really hurt everything was, of course, the protracted development and delays. Now, I mentioned in the video that I did on the Helldiver was that almost 900 design modifications had to ultimately be made to the Helldiver before it was deemed acceptable, which I think in any design scenario is an utterly insane number to have. Now, of course, of those 900 design modifications, a vast quantity were small little tidbit changes, but the cumulative change is the same. The design that we see flying around in a lot of US Navy sort of propaganda and newsreels in 1944 going into 1945 is a vastly different beast to the Helldiver that we see in 1941 when it's first being tested by the Bureau of Aeronautics. During its early service, the Helldiver received, as I mentioned, a number of unfortunate nicknames, including the Beast and the Son of a Bitch Second Class. This was mostly as a result of the airmen taking a distinct dislike to it, but part of it was also a nickname given to it by the people that were actually testing the Helldiver itself, and there are even some unconfirmed reports of various other nicknames being assigned to the aircraft by Curtiss's own engineers. However, there is only one book in my collection on that, and I like to have at least two confirming everything, so I didn't include that in this discussion. However, before I waffle on too much about that, we also need to ask another important question. Okay, the Helldiver has been compromised by naval requirements. Its airframe is not as aerodynamically refined as they would want it, and it has a hydraulic system that is incredibly complicated and prone to failure. However, was Curtiss also to blame? Because, of course, when it came to the SB2C, the naval requirements were not the only thing that led to its poor service history. Now, several of its problems were directly related to poor quality of workmanship, manufacturing issues, or other internal problems which were going on at Curtiss-Wright at the time. Now, while the demanding size requirements and the complicated design of the airframe were, of course, huge contributing factors, the quality of its construction and the reliability of its systems as a result of the quality of that construction cannot be discounted either, and in some cases it was a huge issue. Ooh. For example, the Helldiver's manufacturing quality control was officially rated by the US Navy in 1944 as often poor. In one instance of flap operation failure recorded by the US Navy, as mentioned earlier with the joints of the 74 pivot joints that were failed, that aircraft was taken back by the Bureau of Aeronautics for further testing, and they highlighted no less than 94 other defects in that one single airframe. And following that, they were, of course, obliged to test several other airframes, and they very quickly discovered that the entire production line of the SB2C Helldiver was in dire straits. Early mass-produced version of the main early production model, the SB2C-1, arriving from October 1942, were found to be wanting, and with, I quote, careless construction which went into making the parts for the first airplanes was replaced by mass-produced parts which were defectively designed, carelessly manufactured, or casually inspected. Now, For the fairly conservative reporting of the US Navy, that's a pretty scathing review. The US Navy then had to push Curtiss to take the corrective action necessary to make the airplanes combat worthy. However, this took longer than expected because another contributing problem to the design of the airframe was that Curtiss was using materials of insufficient strength or inferior quality. A commander by the name of E.C. Parker bluntly stated that the accelerated service test revealed entirely too many discrepancies in the quality of metallurgy of the airframe, which was a nice way of saying that the airframe was either corroding or buckling far too quickly. The problems with the quality of the construction of the Curtiss Helldiver and the delays that it faced was so severe that it was investigated by a body known as the Truman Committee in 1943. This was a committee set up and obviously headed by Harry Truman, who then became the President of the United States, as a body to investigate essentially waste, mismanagement, criminal fraud, etc., in the greater military-industrial complex that the US was spooling into as the Second World War progressed. For a quick comparison, this body eventually saved something to the tune of, I think, 15 or 16 billion dollars during the war, which, for comparison, the entirety of the Manhattan Project only cost $2 billion. So they essentially saved 8 times the expenditure of the entire experimental nuclear arm program that was conducted during the war. Key findings and criticisms of this body included Curtiss-Wright was found in general to be hopelessly behind schedule. The company was not producing a single SB2C, which the Navy considered usable as a combat airplane, by March of 1943. There was widespread knowledge of Curtiss-Wright's failure in this regard, which had led to an adverse and psychological effect on the workforce and on general morale. This was particularly prevalent in the Columbus plant and the surrounding area, and this resulted in an incalculable loss of production by their subcontractors. The committee was also critical of Curtiss-Wright's advertising campaign, which at the time was touting the aircraft as the newest and most potent aircraft of the fleet, when in fact US fleet carriers and their commanders were actively refusing to take the SB2C Helldiver on board. The commander of the Yorktown was meant to be taking the Helldiver into action when Midway occurred, but they had performed so badly that he refused to take them aboard his ship and instead elected to switch back to the SBD Dauntless, which was considered by this point obsolete. What a wonderful state of affairs to literally have commanders of a US Navy warship in the middle of an active war refusing to take on the newest aircraft because they did not think it was going to be good enough. If that is not an indictment of the state of the Helldiver in its early career, then I don't know what is. But who bears most of this blame? Was it Curtiss or was it the Navy? Ultimately, yes, Curtiss bears a share of the blame, but a majority of this did come down to the naval requirements. And this is something that the Truman Committee, when investigating Curtiss in 1943, did not take into account, because the committee's report didn't take into account the multiplicity of extra features that were required to be added onto the Helldiver to rectify the issues which were a result of the naval requirements. Number one, the requirement for most of the systems to be run hydraulically, and number two, the requirement for 2 of these things to fit onto the elevator of an Essex-class aircraft carrier, which of course compromised the airframe in a whole different number of ways. Sources have also further suggested that the core reasons for the Helldiver's problems stemmed from the Navy's original specification for fitting the aircraft for the Essex carrier in particular. This was because at the time, when the Helldiver was essentially first being developed, the escort carrier really wasn't a thing. Had things been delayed just a little bit and the US Navy realized that, okay, maybe squeezing 2 onto 1 elevator wasn't going to be such an issue, the aircraft would have been a lot more stable, because its instability was one of the things that held it back from being widely operated at the start of the hostilities by anything other than the fleet carriers, because its takeoff and landing run was considered too risky, let's put it politely, to be operated on anything smaller than, say, an Essex class. Now, to their credit, while the Navy was criticized heavily for its requirements and for essentially dooming the Helldiver to an illustrious start to its career, which resulted in a lot of tragic fatalities and accidents and a very poor record for the first 6 to 9 months of its career, they did back Curtiss at the hilt, and they basically gave Curtiss free rein with the Bureau of Aeronautics to improve the Helldiver so that it would go from a flying death trap into something that was considered vaguely useful. And that brings us to the question of, was it actually that bad? And the long answer is no, it was not eventually anyway. The initial negative reputation that is associated with the Helldiver actually began to change quite quickly once the first modifications were implemented in the design, and this started as early as mid-1943, though many wouldn't believe it. Now, how well did the design perform after the changes were made? Well, first, it's probably a good idea to quickly discuss the structural changes that were made. The fuselage was lengthened and a larger tail was fitted, which makes it, very distinguishable today. Like, this hit. Where's my pen? There we go. That is not a small tail, especially when you compare it to something like a SBD Dauntless. However, this thing was absolutely critical to give the Helldiver the stability it needed. Another big thing that helped the Helldiver was the introduction of perforated dive brakes, which was something that was also done with other dive bombing aircraft as well. And another major issue, which resulted in a lot of early accidents around the hydraulics, was this thing here. The retractable, well, in this case it's not, but originally the Helldiver had a retractable tail wheel to, obviously help with the aerodynamics. This thing collapsed so often because the hydraulics controlling it and the suspension with it just could not cope with the force of carrier landings. This thing broke all the time. And one of the single biggest things that reduced carrier landing accidents with the Helldiver was simply changing that back to a fixed cast ring tail wheel. Another major improvement was the strengthening of the wing folding mechanism, which was at the early stages a point of failure. Excuse me. There was a notable incident not too long, either just before or just after it entered service, where the Bureau of Aeronautics was still taking it through test flights, and they did a high-speed, high-altitude dive test because they didn't want to test anything too close to the ground. And one of the wings decided that it no longer wanted to be a part of the plane anymore and detached. Thankfully, the test pilot was at a high enough altitude that despite this thing careening out of control, he was able to eventually throw himself clear of the airframe and bail out safely. So the wing, the tail wheel, and the tail itself were the three most notable changes in terms of improving its overall performance, but there were of course, other improvements and changes as well. For example, the bomb bay doors actually started open and close when pilots told them to. Other improvements that made the aircraft much better and the ultimate tool for the US Navy in terms of dive bombing included a more powerful engine, which was definitely needed because the aircraft by this point was 42% heavier than the first iteration. The engine was upgraded to the 1900 horsepower version of the R2600, the Dash 20 version, and this drove a 4-blade propeller instead of the previous Curtiss 3-blade propeller. Fixed armament was also improved. The original turret, which was plagued with problems, was replaced by a traditional flexible rear mount, which was two 30 caliber guns, and the front armament was either 4 50 caliber machine guns or I believe 2 20mm cannons. By November 1943, improved versions of the SB2C were beginning to enter service, and they incorporated what became known as the Mod 3 changes. During all of 1943, these Mod 3 changes were applied retroactively to existing airframes, and because of this, Curtiss had to essentially set up a modification production line in their factory. This resulted in a sharp drop-off of new Helldivers being produced for the Navy, which was one of the things that triggered Curtiss being investigated as part of the Truman Committee. But what Curtiss was really doing at the same time was reducing the amount of existing problems with the Helldivers that were in service, because you had one of two options. You either improve the ones you've already got in service as quickly as possible, or you pull them all from service and hope you can build as many as quickly as possible. They chose the former option, viewing it as the safer bet to go for, and also the cheaper bet to go for. Later models, such as the SB2C-5, represented the ultimate version of the aircraft. They included all of the fixes, and they became, and I quote here, a package deal that suited most of its users. By the end of the war, the SB2C was by far and away probably the best dive bomber in service, or ever to be in service with any fleet, be it the US Navy, Japan, Britain, etc. Of course, those were the three main ones that fielded fleet carriers and fleet carrier aircraft. Following all of the improvements, this of course had a dramatic improvement on the Helldiver's performance compared to its early war state of affairs. It had become the main dive bomber for the US Navy by the end of the Pacific War. It sank more tonnage of Japanese shipping than any others in terms of, this is civil and military. If you're going for pure military tonnage, I believe the Dauntless pips it out just, but if we're talking total tonnage of including tankers, military ships, transports, etc., the Helldiver takes the cake. And the pilots, who had originally reported this thing as a death trap, some of whom even faced disciplinary action for refusing to fly the Helldiver and were later on exonerated and had that removed from their record following the findings of the Truman Committee, were now saying that this was a great airframe. It handled beautifully, it dove quickly, and it was remarkably durable. There are many photos of Helldivers returning either to marine land bases on the islands or back to the aircraft carriers with a large amount of battle damage. This is in contrast to the early part of its career, where any sort of battle damage was often, if not fatal, then at least a mission kill, owing to the complexities of the hydraulic systems and a lack of protection over certain parts of the airframe. The pilot was protected, but at the beginning, critical parts of the hydraulic system had no armor protection for obvious reasons, mostly weight saving. Following the Second World War, the Helldiver, as I said earlier on, continued in US Navy service until 1947, and it was in reserve aviation until 1950. By this point, its reputation had well and truly been redeemed. However, there is one important question that we do need to ask, and that is, how did it compare to the thing that it was ultimately meant to replace? Because a lot of people today say that, that the Helldiver was a pointless aircraft to make because it ultimately didn't live up to the reputation of the plane that flew before it, which was the SBD Dauntless. And I think a lot of this is attributed to the Dauntless sort of, taking the crown of things at the Battle of Midway, and the Helldiver not really coming into service until after all of the, the big major critical flashpoints of the early parts of the Pacific campaign had already passed, where, it was a case of, will they, won't they? Is the Japanese going to keep on coming? By the time the Helldiver is in service in large numbers and in a state where it is reliable, the Imperial Japanese Navy is already on the back foot, and that sort of takes away from its successes in a way, because, you're just looking at a string of naval invasions and naval victories, and you can just happily say, oh, the Helldiver was just riding on the coattails of the Dauntless's victory. However, I wanted to do a really quick comparison to show that the Helldiver was indeed, across the board, with the exception of a very few metrics, better than the Dauntless in most ways. For example, you've got size and payload to begin with. The Helldiver was a much larger aircraft. It was designed to carry a considerable array of armament, all of which internally, including a 1,000-pound bomb load. The SBD Dauntless, by contrast, carried its payload externally, which resulted in a much more aerodynamically unrefined design, which of course had a lower top speed and also a lower ability, a lesser responsiveness to either accelerate and get away from things, etc. The Helldiver was, of course, much faster than the Dauntless because of this, and of course it had a much more powerful power plant. The SB2C-4's maximum speed was 295 miles an hour compared to the best version of the Dauntless, which was 255. Sources note that the SB2C-4 outperformed the SBD Dauntless in every category except range, because initial versions of the Helldiver had less range than the comparable version of the Dauntless at the time, but later on this was also evened out. In terms of handling and pilot experience, the Dauntless was described as a fine, sturdy, and reliable platform which was easy to fly and maintain. Pilots found the SBD easier to handle in a dive, to aim, and to keep the ball centered, as in the aiming ball. In contrast, the Helldiver was regarded as difficult to handle and required much more pilot ability to fly compared to the steady and forgiving SBD. This was mostly attributed to the earlier versions of the SB2C Helldiver and not the later versions. However, this is the one metric in which the Helldiver always loses out to the Dauntless in general. It is a more capable platform, it is faster, it is sturdier, however, it is always more unstable and more difficult to fly in general. The controls are always felt to be a little bit heavier than the Dauntless, even on later versions, and the only area in which the pilots ultimately found that it was better in terms of handling was dive performance in later models of the Helldiver. And by later models, I mean the Dash 4 and the Dash 5 variant. Any earlier variants than that lost out to the Dauntless in that as well. Despite improvements, pilots following the war, even those that flew the later models, would still prefer the SBD Dauntless over the Helldiver, despite the fact that on the whole, the Helldiver was a more capable platform. This comes back to the human factor, which I mentioned at the beginning, was this thing left a very poor impression in the minds of anyone who flew it for the first time, because the SBD Dauntless was inherently unstable all the way through its career. It was something that could be mastered, and when it was mastered, it was perfectly serviceable, as long as you didn't tick it off, basically, and if you didn't handle it too roughly. But because of that, people would always prefer the SBD because out of the box, the SBD was easier to fly and the Helldiver was not. This is the thing that ultimately taints its reputation more than anything else. The human factor, because people are going to remember the bad more than they remember the good every single time around. And when you're a pilot, usually the thing you tend to remember the most is how something handles, in the same way that, how you remember how comfortable or how uncomfortable a rental car might be or something like that. It's sort of that just thing that gets ingrained in you most of all. And this is what has tainted the reputation of the Helldiver most of all, especially if you look at early books written on the Helldiver, because a couple were written or at least co-authored by people who either serviced or served in them. Later books on the Helldiver, particularly this one, which is probably the one I recommend to everyone, is a bit more nuanced and fair, but it's still pretty harsh and understandably. But to take a long story to a quick and painful close, the original opening question to my long and rambling speech was the Helldiver as bad as its reputation points out? The short answer is yes. The long answer is no. Yes, it was as bad as its reputation points out, but only if you look at the early models. Later on, it was a very serviceable airframe. It was more effective than the Dauntless if you're looking at pure payload and performance numbers. The only thing that held it back was the stability issues. And that is, of course, a result of the requirements. That is not a result of Curtiss. Curtiss did the best with what they had available to do. They were limited by the requirements that the Navy imposed on them. And when they changed the airframe and it lengthened it and increased the size of the tail, etc., they turned a fatally uncontrollable machine into a safe but still somewhat uncontrollable machine. They did the best with what they could. The end result was a good aircraft that was ultimately flawed by its DNA and something that did hurt Curtiss's reputation in the long run. And although it was not the sole reason for the sort of downfall of Curtiss as a manufacturer, its impact on Curtiss's reputation cannot be understated, and it definitely soured the reputation that Curtiss had built up with the US Navy, and it's one of the reasons why various other manufacturers, particularly Douglas, got more of a preferential hand when the US Navy started issuing fresh contracts again after the initial period of contraction and cuts in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And of course, by the 50s, Curtiss was not really in the aircraft game at all. That concludes what I wanted to ramble on about. And I hope that that was less rambly than I that I fear that it came across at. I'm happy to answer a few questions though about any of the points that I discussed here.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for doing this talk.
No, that's all right. Oh, I haven't done one of these. I haven't done one of these in over a year, so I'm very out of practice.
I think I suppose I'll start us off for questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it or not. Where were the SB2Cs usually manufactured?
So a lot of them were manufactured in Columbus. So at this point in the war, that's another point that really hurts it is SB2C production was hampered by the fact that Curtiss was still clinging on to the P-40 Warhawk. And so the factory that was producing the Warhawk in large numbers actually had a lot of the most experienced machinists in terms of aircraft production. This impacted the quality of workmanship on the SB2C Helldiver because when the US went through its emergency factory expansion program, Curtiss-Wright was obviously a part of that. And their area that received, the new factories that were built under the purchasing scheme, those new factories are the ones where a lot of these Helldivers were built. This means you've got a fairly inexperienced workforce producing what at the time was the most complicated aircraft the US Navy had ever required. And was one of the contributing factors to the early hydraulic systems in particular having so many problems and defects because they're one of the most complicated parts of the airframe to build. Columbus was the main factory, but there was another factory, I believe, in it wasn't Tulsa, that's Douglas. Somewhere else, East Coast, in West, I want to say West Virginia. It's in the book. I should have memorized that, but yeah. But a vast majority of these were built in the Columbus plant. Of the 7,100 and something built, a vast quantity were built directly by Curtiss, although some were built by subcontracted plants as well.
That makes sense. I'm sure a lot of people that tune into these are New York, and a lot of them have ties to the Buffalo plant. So they'll love the compliment of that they were more experienced over there.
Yes, I bet. Yeah, they definitely were. Like the Buffalo plant was the cream of the crop as far as Curtiss-Wright were concerned.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can type them in the chat if you'd like as well.
Oh, perfect. Yep.
If we're waiting for some, I actually have another question. I'm not too familiar on naval dive bombers or what their role is in combat necessarily. They seem pretty slow. Was their speed really that much of a disadvantage, or?
So you would think so, but the main doctrine by this point in the war, particularly if we're just focusing on the US Navy, dive bombers, you basically take them. They take off in obviously large groups. The speed is a bit of a hindrance, of course. But the dive bombers are usually meant to be going in escorted, and they go in at high altitude. Well, they later go in especially at high altitude. Early on in the war, you sort of had mixed altitude formations. But the thing that really solidified this with the US Navy was at the Battle of Midway, because when the Dauntlesses came in and attacked the Japanese fleet carriers at Midway, they came in from a high altitude. They were over 20-something thousand feet. This gave them the advantage of a bit of cloud cover, which made them difficult to spot, and it also gave them plenty of time to sight their targets. It also gave them some additional protection from the Japanese close air patrol, which had already engaged the torpedo bombers that had gone in, and they were going in at a lower altitude. So the Japanese cap was already at low altitude, and they weren't able to climb up in time. The other thing with dive bombers is, because obviously you're a dive bomber, you're going at a vertical angle, the altitude, the sort of minimal altitude you want to be at is probably going to be around 10,000 feet in absolute pinch. But 15,000 feet or higher is usually fine. At that altitude, your performance is significantly better than anything near sea level. So when we look at things like, absolute top speeds and that, you'll see that with the Dauntless and with the Helldiver, their sea level top speed versus their altitude top speed is actually significantly different. By this stage in the war as well, it is very quickly becoming apparent that speed was never going to be the thing that saved these planes anyway. It was going to be escorts. Very, very quickly, the whole maxim of, with speed and defenses, the bomber will always get through. That gets blown out of the water very, very quickly. If you get engaged, the moment you start, this thing could be a really fast dive bomber, but the moment, because it's so big and heavy and clunky, the moment it starts going to evasive maneuvers, that speed is going to evaporate anyway. Its only option is either going to be close air patrol escorting it, or in a pinch, it could dive away because it is, after all, designed as a dive bomber. But if it's diving away evasively, it is then giving up that altitude advantage, that energy advantage. And these things take a good while to climb. They do not have the climb performance of a fighter. So yeah, speed is, of course, like with any military plane, speed is, of course, an important factor, but it is not the thing that defines these, like you would find, say, with a fighter or an interceptor.
That clears it up perfectly, honestly. I think I was looking at it from a European front perspective, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely, like, especially with like the land war in Europe, the speed factor is definitely something different. But, in the vast ocean of the Pacific, when you're flying over, thousands of miles, you're only going to encounter usually the enemy over the point of attack. So for the majority of your sortie, the only thing your speed is going to do is determine your range and how quickly you can get to your mission target, basically.
All right, going once, going twice for questions. Anyone? Well, alrighty. Thank you so much, Chris.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, it's again, I'm a bit out of practice at this, but hopefully I didn't ramble on too much.
Oh,
And
no.
at some point, I don't know when yet because things have been really topsy-turvy with work and that stuff. I do have a planned like kind of museum tour to the States in the works. So I'm going to hopefully try and do some in-person talks when I get over there. At the moment, it's penciled in for spring or summer 2026. That is subject to change owing to a couple of financial and career things going on this side, but it's roughly penciled in for then. My ultimate plan is I'm hoping to tie it in so that I can go to the air tattoo in the UK and then immediately hit up Oshkosh in the States. But I've got to check the dates first because this year they were on the same weekend, which is why I didn't go this year. But I think next year they're a weekend apart. So I think the plan is hit up the UK for a couple of weeks, do Riyadh, then bolt over to Oshkosh and then do museum hop for a couple of weeks. But that is
if you ever want to
still in the
pop
work.
by, we'd love to have you.
Oh no, you're definitely on my plan itinerary, so you'll be getting an email from me at some point going, "Hey, I'm probably going to be in the area at this time."
And yeah, we can. I can send you an aircraft list of anything you might be interested in. Because
wonderful! Thank you so much.
But yeah, thank you so much for everyone for coming tonight. I'll end the meeting now. Hope everyone has a nice night.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good night.